I'm delighted to introduce Sumayya Vally today. I'm delighted because I think I learned about your work in February when in The Guardian of all journals, when you were announced in your studio as the youngest firm to be commissioned to design the Serpentine Pavilion in London. Your studio made headlines, and thus we were acquainted with your really important work. So thank you so much for joining us at the Cooper Union Lecture Series this evening. And just to give a small introduction to this event, we're welcoming today Counterspace Studio, which is a Johannesburg-based collaborative architecture office. And we're also welcoming its founder and principal, Sumayya Vally. Through publishing, pedagogy, build things, which Sumayya identifies as different from buildings and other forms of architecture, Counterspace is committed to developing design expression, particularly for the African continent. The studio operates intertwined with the Academy, and Sumayya is teaching at the Graduate School of Architecture in Johannesburg. And as I hear, the weather is really, really good there, and we're all very jealous. And she's also very much committed to intertwining her research and build practice with collateral research actions and events in the city. In September 2020, while I was in conversation with Sumayya during the summer, during the pandemic, and it was a time for interjection for all of us, I assume, I read a letter at the Architectural Review that Sumayya wrote to herself, and she described in her words that architecture is waiting to happen in places that are often overlooked. She writes in particular, "Dear Sumayya, you will soon fall in love with gold, kitsch, supernatural ideas, with very strange and everyday things, the performance of a ritual gathering on a patch of veld grass of a traffic island next to a highway, the rhythms and a space of an Ethiopian coffee ceremony, the specific color spectrum of a mind dump sunset, the tenacity of indigenous plants and indigenous ceremonies and practices. Learn how to dissect the index of an archive and how to make your own indexes for archives. Don't listen to anyone who tells you that everything you can ever imagine has already been done. They're incorrect." And I'm very glad that you're saying that, because you have proved that this is indeed incorrect, with you designing one of the most important commissions that were usually held for Pritzker-winning architects. As such, today, Sumayya will illustrate, in her words, how architecture is a condensation and an overlaying of times, stories, fields, excerpts, archaeologies, and forensic samplings. Practice, research, and pedagogy presents us with platforms to think through and respond to the connections between history, forces of labor, race and class struggles, capitalism, toxicity, and climate change. This type of constellation of ideas, events, places is also highlighted in the design of the famous proposal for the Serpentine Pavilion, a collection of events, actions, and fragments that she describes as found dispersed in the City of London and transferred back to Kensington Gardens as imprints of places, spaces, and artifacts which have made care and sustenance part of London's identity. So with that short introduction, I would like to welcome Sumayya Vally, and the discussion is going to be moderated after the lecture by my colleagues, Haley Aber, who's the Associate Dean at the Cooper Union, and Nora Akawi, who's an Assistant Professor at the Cooper Union. Sumayya, thank you so much for joining us, and you can take the floor.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for that generous and warm introduction. And thank you so much for having me at the Cooper Union. I'm so deeply honored to be here virtually in these halls, I think, against the backdrop of so many architects that I admire so deeply. And I'm particularly excited about your theme of entanglements. And also I'm really excited that you've chosen to focus and highlight the work of emergent and divergent forms of practice like my own as well. My work is very small and very humble, but I do think it's going somewhere. And just to briefly introduce the film I'm about to share with you, I just want to say that Counterspace was started when I was still a student. At the time, a silent uproar of conviction and aspiration in the face of pessimism, a reaction and a response to the architectural profession and canon. And this presentation contains some of my thoughts, politics, obsessions, inspirations, intentions, frustrations, ambitions, and desires for Johannesburg. And I hope that you'll see each of these things embodied in the projects that I'm about to share. I've divided this presentation into 3 streams of information. So it really just is a taster into 3 streams of consciousness. And I'm really looking forward to the engagement and the discussion on the other side. I hope you'll have lots of questions. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now. If anyone can't hear or can't see, or there are any issues, just let us know.
Architecture is a condensation and an overlaying of time, stories, field notes, excerpts, archaeologies, and forensic samplings. Practice, research, and pedagogy present us with platforms to think through and respond to the inextricable connections between history, forces of labor, race and class struggles, capitalism, toxicity, and climate change. Diverse origins and forms of practice, events, rituals, atmospheres, temperaments that bring to light our deep pasts and deep futures are not novel or radical. For my practice context, they are simply implicit and imperative. Counterspace was started when I was a student. At the time, a silent uproar of conviction and aspiration in the face of pessimism, a reaction and a response to the architectural profession and canon. Thoughts, politics, obsessions, inspirations, intentions, frustrations, ambitions, and desires for Johannesburg are embodied in each of our projects. This presentation is organized into 3 streams of information. The first of these streams is tempo. Speed, time, manifesto, politics, intention, context, rhythm, pace, beat. Rather than organize work typologically, programmatically, or in scales, I think of my work in speeds, as incomplete answers to the questions of our context. Each project is a response to a search for a uniquely Johannesburg and African design language. In slow, meandering research work, from ongoing photography to my teaching studio, our work is asking and experimenting with new questions and research for design languages in Joburg. These speeds operating at the same time inform and catalyze each other in search of new Joburg practice manifestos. Tone, color, atmosphere, hue, saturation, mood, voice, timbre, spirit, resonance, temper, note. Material palettes of light, color, and sound. Atmospheres are drawn from the oral, and the embodied. In dust and soil, in the atmosphere, in the market, in the home, in the kitchen, in our stories, myths, recipes, and songs. Thing. Device, tool, matter, instrument, material, form, built output, affair, business, proceeding, situation, circumstance, happening, or trouble. These atmospheres and speeds are translated into design form. We think through concept on the scale of the detail and the choreographies which abound them. The political intent, the mood of the project, must be embodied and embedded in the material crystallization. The earth of a place is an archive of its past, presents, and futures. It is a physical and material condensation of histories of movement, visions, rituals, and politics of place, physically sedimented and printed in its surface. The earth of a place, its soul, is a generative place, a call to work, an unearthing of potential histories, potential futures. For example, Project Folded Skies, 26.2041 degrees south, 28.0473 degrees east. Tempo, instant, momentary, fleeting, sunrise, sunset, midnight. Captures of Joburg light at different times of the day. Snapshot, flare, latent image into visible image, double exposure, long exposure, dye destruction, singe, glow, light, horizon, sky, mist, mine dust, pollution, iridescent skies, sunrise at top star mine dump, rust, rusting, rusted, buffer zone, no man's land, 1886, tomorrow, the year 2032. Tone, 160952 TCX gold dust, iridescent, Joburg light, acid tones, singed toxic runoffs, inorganic chemical colors, lead oxide, cobalt blue, lead iodide dust. Thing, P126, Revision B, Project Team, Counterspace with Stay Evil Kids, issued for construction. Horizon Capture Sculpture Steel Shape 03, Detail 09, inspired by Joburg, constructed at Spear, December 2018. 50 by 50 by 3 mm mild steel angle, welded to 4 mm mild steel plate. Finish, matte black powder coated. 6 mm glass mirror chemically bonded to plate. Glass sheet chemically coated with cobalt, copper and aluminium compound mix. 45-minute coating process, 2-day curing process. Project, hands-on maths. Tempo, instant. Deep time, indigenous knowledges, kit of parts assembly. Volume, indigenous algorithms and geometries. Click into place, snap, lock, dispatch, clip, stack, pack, unravel, reorder, unorder. Tumble, fumble, mismanage, step up, totem, tessellate, pattern, repeat, collocation, opposition, apposition, scramble, scurry, push, juxtaposition, assemble geometries into place. An alphabet of meaning, new Platonic orders, new Ndebele orders, other fundamentals, a new coded set of swatches and patterns and sentences. Tone, 161526 TCX terracotta. Primary, bright gold, dolomite pink, high felt yellow, clay orange sand, Zanin papaya trees, matumi trees, visceral barren landscape, rolling hills, undulating surfaces, new horizon, new horizontals, upside down, right side up, pattern, symmetry, hierarchies, mathematical intricacies. P049, Project Team, Counterspace with Play Africa. Location, mobile, from N Street Park, Hillbrow, to Spa Parking Lot, Corner Hospital Street, Limpopo. Lightweight interlocking stackable volumes, 300 by 300 by 200 mm thick, trihedron, triangulated tessellated shapes in super dense injection molded expanded foam. 3D children's puzzle to learn about geometries, volumes, and mathematical universes. Project, Children's Right Exhibit. Tempo, instant. Tone, 1202727 TCX Sunshine Yellow. An exploded house of rights and fundamentals of home, archetypal elements, shelter, threshold, access, light, free association. Project, Children's Courtroom. Tempo, instant. Tone, 14411 TCX School Uniform Blue. A wireframe court installation at the Constitutional Hill Courtyard. Role play for child witnesses. Hierarchies, rearrangement and re-empowerment. Project, Dazzle. Tempo, instant. Tone, 190303 TCX Jet Black. 114800 TCX Blanc de Blanc. A one-night architecture conceived for viewers in Jeppestown. A performance on a building in Maboneng. Camouflage, espionage, theatre of war. Project, Aperture for SA Fashion Week. Tempo, instant. Camera flash, 11-minute architecture, appearing and disappearing. 3 fan rotations per second. Turn the ramp on its side. Allow the audience in. Peep, peer. Create vistas and focal points. Autofocus. Interruptions in the surface choreographed to music. Moving bodies. The drift of white paper sheets. 2-dimensional sheets become activated by bodies. Projected moving image. Light, fashion. Veil, unveil. Hide, reveal. Tone 193911 TCX total eclipse. The blue of skin tones against the white backdrop. Black and white lights activate the surface. A red floor, a purple-white glow, a gray-white backdrop, ice-white surface, monochrome projection, the endless colors of clothes. P127, issued for construction, detail 11, 90 GSM handbag lining suspended from ceiling trusses at 900mm intervals, overlapping and overlaid sheets to create telescopic facades. 10-watt 5000K cool white uplights at 30-degree upward angles, projected onto to activate areas of cut and fold. Project scale sail. Tempo instant. Tone 162130 TCX knockout pink. A set of existing architectures by Cartel, imagined in new places and at new scales. Chair column, column building, building planet. Left twist, half pipe. A mute grab while airing front side. Airwalk, Benihana, alley-oop. A spinning trick on transition. Spinning to the right, airing to the left. Busting shapes. The wooden part of skateboard assembly, usually of hard maple. Interlocking urban and landscape forms. 7 to 14 years, transitional space. 2 to 5 p.m., school holidays, moving from space to space. Monday, Tuesday, Saturday, Sunday. A new classroom landscape every day of the week. Economic challenges. The soft space for girls in a hard and fast city for men. Tone millennial pink. 161735 TCX millennial pink. Impatience. An instant generation. Pink skies, white boulders. Wildflower purple pebbles. A millennial pink classroom attention span. A hot pink attitude. Strawberry pink sass. A go-go red energy for moving, shifting and lifting. P44. Location Skatistan, Kabul, Mazar-e Sharif, Phnom Penh, Doornfontein. Welcome to the land of skate. An after-school center focused to girls, issued for construction. A set of interlocking triangulated desks in 19mm marine plywood. Detail 08. Rubber set millennial pink polyurethane hold grips at varying heights attached to marine ply surface storage unit. Elements to be configured as individual units to create library shelves or communal desks, climbing landscapes or as desired. Project Squiggle House. Tempo steady, meander, drift. Age-old geologies and mountain contours. Later river canyon forms, winding up, through and across. Heavy volumes lifting toward the rising sun. Secret cave spaces, seen and unseen interiors, crevices, cracks. Massive sweeping bands pull, lift and turn. Strata rising from the earth. A series of thick walls rise from the natural contours on the site. All service functions, pantry, ablution, storage, are contained inside them, leaving stepped contours open and free for living space. Tone 191540 TCX burnt henna. Segments of the earth rising, light falling in. Smooth and rough slippages between cooking, reading, at rest. P109. Location Mpumalanga. A home for in-betweening. Issued for tender. 5 ribbons, 5 walls. Rammed earth from the site, the temperature, consistency, suppleness, texture of mud used for building. Project Fat Wall. Tempo imminent. Protests, please must fall. Traffic, cars, taxis, rain, sun, a harsh campus edge. Walls, walls, walls. Fences. 2-second boom gate delay. Watch out for spikes. Fortress. From thick barren barriers into fat walls with functions. The buffer strip. A mediator between the city and the school. Student dignity. A wall as a space. An inhabitable edge. A two-way street. Cigarette cellar. Vending machines. A new landscape of infrastructures. Lighting, seating, waiting. A 1.5 person seat. A shopping laptop for a child. Tone 120645 TN halogen yellow. An institutional grey. An imposing monochrome. A new firefly glow. A soft warm glow at night. Sheets of translucent luminescent concrete rise out of the ground, creating spaces for sitting, waiting, watching, being watched. A stark transition between a grey campus and a Technicolor Braamfontein is mediated. A tiny strip of lush green, fragrant lemon, hydrangeas, and the smell of coffee and a 13 Rand muffin. P082, location Enoch Santonga Gatehouse, Wits University, Braamfontein. Issued for tender. 300 MPa concrete with fluorescent yellow aggregate. Night 1000 lux level night glow for 6 hours. Detail 09. Double skin translucent yellow polycarbonate sheets made to form a box, backlit, attached to steel staircase to create social balcony and waiting area for students. Cattail grass, bioswale, microclimate adjusted, edge softened, edge fattened. Project Patch 2 Park Drive. Tempo sliding. 2 speeds, 2 opens, and 2 closes. 2 languages and conversations from opposite ends of Asia. Land stack turn, overhang, slash, slice, clip, fasten, then fold into the site. Corrugated programs of leisure and of function. Monday to Sunday, truck reverses, goods hauled, doors lifted, goods slide in, stacked, tucked, door pulled down. Wait for shelves to empty, repeat. Tuesday nights and every second Saturday, chairs slide out, tables on casters. Slowly, friends hug and go to the counter. A queue winds out. Strawberry pink milkshakes all afternoon. Upstairs, an expanding plume of cigar smoke and the sound of a shaver. The barber is back from Bangladesh. A meshing and a hybridizing, a set of urban currencies, tongues, gods, goods, in one address, a double life, a world in a world. Tone 161720 TCX Strawberry Ice, Coral Haze. Occupation of a once grey area in Johannesburg. China Mall open every day. Red, left in the sun. Avalon Cinema sign left in the dark. The church bells from across the road's pink face, long since silent. Diagonals of pink slit over yellow cliffs of weight, feet and Hong Kong shipping stations. Super graphic. Slices. Pixelated into triangles. Pine green wraps inside. In between stripes in the containers lay bare. Opens are cut. Windows and doors of clear polycarbonate that tip up to let the sun in. The elevation is deep and layered like a wrapped present. P110. Folded life from Jaipur to Hong Kong. A site sitting on the edge of Mayfair and on the edge of Crown Mines, just behind Dragon City. Client dream. 9 shipping containers to in part hold storage for the next door wholesalers and another part lean on the budding leisure economy of Mayfair. Hydroponic mint growing on the roof, issued for construction. Masala chip rolls dipping with sauce. Coca-Cola sign, cartoons and westerns once on at the Avalon, Fortsburg. 6mm dark plexiglass formed cursive text and backlit with LED. Kentucky's Milk Bar. A historical legacy of mixed-race couples at the films. 4mm clear rounded toughened glass display counter, pneumatic tip-up door, existing container door panels to be reused, resprayed in enamel paint, 2 coats, cheap plastic trinkets shipped for 2 months across the Atlantic. Project Brixton Mosque. Tempo Drifting. Allahu Akbar, 5 times a day. The church bells used to clang too, 9 o'clock on Sundays, like a cacophony, a melody, a new set of harmonies. Sunrise, sunset, the conversion of an old Dutch Reformed church into a mosque. A minaret made of light appears at only 5 times in the day. On Fridays, the new street edge is animated. Children climb, traders trade, people meet, present and represent. A form emerges, a geometric merge between the old church arches and new parabolic orders, new and old, dreamers, wishers, worshippers from 2 religions and times. The architectures pray together, reveal and conceal, hide and seek, past, present, and future. Tone 11-1001 TCX Pantone White Asylum. Cover, wrap, veil, white. A blank skin skirts the street-facing facades. Smooth as new insertion against the line-faced brick of the existing building. Bagwash coated. Color as one monolith, unifying past and present purposes. A sanctuary in the bustling suburb, a space for reflection, respect, and ritual. Skins of people set apart as jewels against the blankness. Dark Somalian skin, light Pakistani skin, all sorts of latitudes and lightness and darkness against the blank. P063, location Brixton, transformative program users in space. Frequented by migrants in the community. North elevation, issued for tender, a reimagination of a meshed religious space. Introduction of the archetypal Islamic geometric representations onto the solid presence of the inherited church building. Backlit 9mm translucent polycarbonate on 30x76 lightweight steel substructure, bolted to parapet of existing turret. Light switched on, turns church bell into tower minaret. 250mm translucent reinforced concrete monolithic arches to engineer's spec. Translucent concrete colonnade, a second skin, a refuge from the street. Church clock and altarpiece remain inside, anchor points to time.
You've arrived at your destination.
Project ETA now, hashtag UberLightUp. Tempo now. 4-minute walk to the stop, head southeast, turn left onto Bertha Street. At the interchange, make sure you have enough space on the other side of the crossing where there are several dozens of people standing and waiting for taxis. Turn left onto Tutor Street. Be careful on that corner because it is dark and it is Joburg. Take the exit on the left, then turn right. A project brief from Uber to light up Joburg transformed into: do you have a space to wait with dignity? A safe route to walk? Does your phone have enough juice? Need Wi-Fi? A place to wait is more than just a place to wait. Tone 11-1001 TCX fluorescent blue. Waiting in Joburg. A street corner where someone used to sell chupa chups and cigarettes 7 years ago. The 4 smell of weed. Young lovers, influencers, a student struggling to cross Empire. 8 armed robbers and a shooting on the interchange. A new set of hashtag light up safe spaces. A set of street lights for waiting. Sit, charge, chat, look, watch, read. Programmed activities and eyes on the street at night. P128, location Braamfontein. Client Uber. Budget 570,000 rand. Issued for construction at Wits campus edges and on Tutor Street, Braamfontein. A set of furniture pieces in extruded patterns that allow for seating, waiting, signage, shelter, wayfinding, and light. A set of Joburg typographies and typologies. One of them could become a pop-up museum, another a pop-up library, next to a space where someone is getting their hair braided. A set of soft, micro-infrastructures on the street. Project, Ponte after images. Tempo, latent. Tone, 193903, TCX shale gray. Gray zone. An ongoing archive. An archaeology of anthropological objects. Family photos, visa applications, tenant applications in apartheid South Africa in the 80s. We don't know who these people were, but their life in the building forms part of an undocumented history of tenure in Hillbrow when it was a grey zone. These stories and lives around this skyscraper has tentacles into deep worlds of city-making, bureaucracies, migration, pop cultures, and economies. How objects are categorized becomes a way for us to construct narratives about others. And the way we put things together tells us more about ourselves and our biases than it does about the other. Project, Imbeleko Arts Center. Tempo, glacial. Rolling hills, infinite horizon, 1,000 hills forming around a majestic valley. The Ngeni and Msunduzi rivers and their tributaries, historic waters reconciling, a gorge emerging, nature growing, shaping an endless landscape, the clear blue African sky meeting the body of the mountain. Oral histories erupting from where the valley meets the ridge, indigenous settlements, rondavels made from the earth, rife with history, embedded in politics of territory, legacy of the Zulu homeland, stained by blood battles, territorial space, rehabilitation of site, reclamation of space, dance, food, smell, imagination, walking, running through the valley, songs and whispers. A set of fingers in the landscape, structural and sculptural, each with a different atmosphere. In a safe wall building, exterior walls dissolve to become forests, walls, roofscapes, and landscapes for community play and interaction. A public topography on the outside and a safe house for girls on the inside. Tone 176030 TPG, jelly bean green. Lush landscapes, deep palettes of green and brown, red clay sand, the melting, scorching African sunset, rust and gold, mountain dripping with wet blue waters, the vastness dappled with sparks of brightly colored patterns and shapes, red, white, blue, green, orange. Corrugated roofs spark and simmer in the sunlight, memories of green. P018, Imbeleko Foundation of Hope. Location, Valley of 1,000 Hills, KwaZulu-Natal. 2012 to present. Revision A, Sumayya Concept Design, Vertical Forest, issued to client. Date 07/05/2012. Plan 200 meters squared. Revision B, Revision C, Revision D, Revision E. Revision F, Sarah Concept Design, Play Roofscape, Color and Shape. Plan 150 square meters. Issued to client, new budget. Revision G, Amina Concept Design, Building Echoing Memory of Landscape, issued to client. Plan 200 meters squared, issued to quantity surveyor, issued to funders. Cut budget, plan 50 meters square, issued to QS, issued to funders, issued to client, wait. Project, backstory. Tempo, happening. Tone, 183838 TCX ultraviolet. A shopfront space for architecture and event. The discussion and perpetuation of ideas. A passerby sees a QR code for a #MeToo mapping session. Stills from Baloji's new zombie film are projected from the space into the alleyway. A movie poster, a soup kitchen, and a mini library are also spaces of the revolution. Project, conversation rooms, terms of engagement. Tempo, rolling. Tone, salon pink. A set of spaces for the prompting and recording of conversations about architecture, used in different contexts. A one-to-one, a group discussion, a sharing circle, a solitary moment, a date. Project, Pan-African Food Station. Tempo, brewing. What color is your jollof? This project looks at the rituals surrounding food spaces and food practices in Joburg. Conceived as an installation for the Wuzhan Biennale in China, the project proposes a dinner table where visitors are invited to take a seat at the table and share a meal with the person next to them, while reading recipes, traditions, and rituals from across Africa, hybridized by Joburg. The configurations of the table are drawn and extrapolated from the eating rituals of Yeovil, Johannesburg, and Sansa Sandila's Pan-African plate. Project Lost and Found. Tempo, creeping. Slow, seeping, a zoom out, an urban archaeology, epochs of toxicity. Generational disease and degradation. Eroding, uncovering, revealing new layers of an old, undocumented history. An object becomes host to a coral-like formation of turquoise crystals. Incremental growth of yellow sand mountains. Shifting and changing landscapes. A new man-made nature, scripted by subterranean gold. Geological conditions, ecologies, life forms, urban practices, rituals, and rites hybridize and mutate. Stories, practices, myths, legends that establish themselves over generations, appearing in quick flashes. Tone 160952 TCX Nugget Gold. Acid yellow, ferrous yellow and white, ferrous red, nickel blue, nickel green, copper blue, a green Zion Star badge, a red poster advertising a Valentine special, a white rubber glove, chemically tinted blue bones from an undocumented cemetery of Chinese migrant workers, a crackling amber fire bearing witness to slaughter rites. P07, from Langlach to Joburg to Chicago Architecture Biannual and back again, ongoing. Collaborators, Jason Larkin. A series of 92 Petri dishes attached to the wall. 7.5 times magnifier magnifying glasses. Vinyl text of news headline stories from The Sun, The Sunday Times, Saturday Star, and The Citizen, spaced 100 millimeters apart from each other at reading height. Viewers are invited to construct their own narratives of image and text. Snapshots of new urbanism developing in the buffer zones. Objects in the Petri dishes set in resin. Eggshells from a prayer ritual. Acid mine crystal formations. Fossilized glass bottle caps from the Joburg Water Company from 1897. A history rising to the surface with the toxic runoffs. Project Aesthetics of Absence. Tempo, latent. An ongoing archive in a space of erasure. Fluctuating, disappearing, now and then, before and after. Johannesburg policy, erasure of the unsightly. Cycles of use, traces of relics, imprinted memories. Architecture coming alive as communities cluster. Daily schedule, midnight to 3 a.m., bustling with waste pickers sorting their waste. At sunrise, they vacate the building on their daily routes. Inside the building, dark, cold, no sense of time, recreated, repurposed time, existing as a city in itself. Tone 160952 TCX Black Hole. Amber fires, charcoal ashen surfaces, collage textures and qualities, brown cardboard boxes, sharp edges of broken window panes, crumpled specks of colored trash, fabrics blowing in the wind. Yesterday's textures disappear with a fresh coat of green paint, freshly painted colorful window panes. P02, Orrit Street Recyclers, 2014. Location, Jeppestown, Johannesburg. P042, Where Are We Now? The Aesthetics of Absence, 2016. Location, several locations across the city, Orrit Street, Commissioner Street, N Street, Janey Street, Jeppe Street, Chung Street, Riley Street. Research project documents before and after drawings of several bad buildings in Joburg, captured from on-site visits and Google Earth date tracking. Project What's Up Vleerhof. Tempo, generational. How to make friends and enemies, a new community WhatsApp group. A recording booth for oral histories of a forgotten colored community held at the Dragon Boat Race Day. A storytelling session for aspirations of the young community held at a pop-up market day. Stories are data too. Soft data. Waiting, counting, 1, 2, 3 cars speeding by. people catching taxis, walking to work, counting, collecting, capturing, chatting. A chatter in the street, gossip from the neighbor, tempers, tantrums, and new friends. Tone 160952 TCX acid yellow. Interview booth for oral histories, portraits, landscapes, housing sitting on the edge of vast golden mine dumps. Old versus new, color-coded mapping, surveys and statistics. Collated data, yellow, aspirations, orange, perceptions, pink dot, danger, gold dot, safe, yellow star, white stickers for comments, green dot, pink hard hat, red, yellow, orange, participation posters. P065, what's up Vleerhof? Location, Vleerhof. Date, 2017. Client, City of Johannesburg and the Joburg Development Agency. Urban design team led by Albonico Sack, Metacity. Counterspace, WSP, Rebel Economics. Aims and objectives, understanding the local context, learning through active involvement, empowering through information sharing, and enhancing value through co-production. 03 June 2017. Ebenezer Church, 25 Shoot Drive. Community Workshop, 24th June 2017. Vleerhof Squash Courts. Outputs, Aspirations and Perceptions Map. Pop-up Conversation Booth. Vleerhof Squash Courts. Aspirations and Perceptions Map. Vleerhof Market Day, Spinal Street. Community Stories. A roving and traveling oral history archive. Sydney and Tanisha want an ice rink. Bashir is worried about the burnt-down community hall, and Lennoth would love for there to be more activities for young people to keep them off the streets. Project, Muckley Necropolis. Tempo, Ancient. A legacy and ancient world eroding to dust. Times of kings, saints, myths, and superstitions. Tone, 160952 TCX, dusk. Sunset on dusty plains. The bright blues and reds of Kashi tiles painted by local women. An entirely new network and economy around cultural heritage and design expression. Yasmin Lari's research on the Muckley Necropolis restoration. Composition: sand, bamboo, lime, silica, mud, straw, water, sunlight. Set in the sun, the traces of ancient forms on the hands of young men and women. Inheritances are chosen as much as they are passed on. Project, Unit 12, An African Almanac. Speed, deep time. Speculative histories and futures, African edge conditions, design languages for cultural hybridity and identity, gender, race, politics, borders, storytelling, narrative, myth, performance, the wayward, the embodied, the overlooked. Hijra refers to immigrating, passing, or coming, a word with both Latin and Arabic roots. Historically, it describes the Prophet Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina, escaping persecution. Included in its etymology are the words for departure, exodus, and journey. Interestingly, in Urdu, the term has also come to mean fluidity of identity, or a third identity, of gender and culture in particular. In this definition, the body is understood to be a literal site of transition, a vessel through which culture and identity journey, a place in which both are housed. Perhaps in this project, an African and Arab summer sun rises over a digital square, and communities of women, diasporas, Arabs, non-Arabs, Black indigenous people of color, gender fluid, multi-religious, literate, abled, and others are there to greet it. Flash, instant, steady, meander, percolate, latent, emerge, drifting, rolling, brewing, creeping, deep time. The full color and atmospheric spectrum. A material palette of books, paper, performances, music, sound, choreography, events, ritual, installations, projections, Velcro, vinyl, duct tape, neon spray paint, neon flex, speech, text, fabric, scripts, coding, posters, pastes up, rubber, steel, timber, glass, bricks, mortar. The work in these atmospheres, tools, and various timescales expands and feeds into our present worlds and streams of consciousness. Ultimately, we want to produce work which redraws the real architecture of society, and for that we must speak in architectural tongues and draw dreams.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sumayya. That was pretty amazing. Seems like every time we have an online lecture, the bar gets raised higher and higher for what you can do on the screen. And you went at the end of the semester, the bar was really high, but somehow you leaped right over that. That's really great. Just, yeah, an incredible array of work exposing rituals, performances, installations, parks, navigated through the tempo, tone, and thing. Was all pretty incredible. Really hard to, definitely certain themes were emerging there, even though there was a kind of oversaturation of all these types of media and stories. But yeah, I think for me, and maybe I can just open up the discussion. And Nora, I don't know if I should just get started, or maybe you have one or two comments, but I'll just jump in, which is the question of multiple identities in your work. And I think some of the projects deal with that directly, right? The Brixton Mosque, as it contends with both a mosque and a church. I'm thinking of the Folded Skies, which also juxtaposes and superimposes certain things. But really the issue of multiple identities and superimpositions of culture and inclusivity. And I just wonder if you could just speak a little bit about how the context of Johannesburg, which really has to contend with those as like key themes, and how that really impacts your work. And I just wonder if you could make that connection between the projects of the multiculturalism, these search for identities within the context of the city and the realm in which you're working.
Thank you, Ellie, for that question. Absolutely, I think that a big part of being in Johannesburg is very much about navigating very exciting and very vibrant diversity, but also, of course, as we know, that comes with all of its challenges and its tensions as well. And I think that it's really important for me in my work that we don't shy away from those tensions, but that we really try to work with them as part of the project. My teaching studio as well is very much focused on this idea of navigating hybrid and multiple identities. And I think for myself, as a South African, Indian, Muslim woman of color, and I can add many, many, many hyphens to that as well, I'm sure. It's really, I think that each of these hyphens, if I can call them that, or hyphenations, gives us an added lens or an added language to be able to see the context differently. And I think that I'm really interested in not so much in finding a common ground, but really in bringing difference to the fore. And I think I'm interested in doing that in practice, but also in the landscape of practice and in the landscape of design expression. I really, really believe that this is super important. Now more than ever, but really my practice was also, as I said, started with this intent in mind, to be able to navigate and negotiate and express Johannesburg through design, I think means taking on these forms of difference directly. And I'm super interested in drawing through different media, whether that's through film or performance and choreography, or some of the things that Lydia mentioned around atmosphere and so on in the beginning. I think that these are all things that might not be able to be contained in conventional architectural tools, and certainly in my practice context, that these things about our city are difficult to contain in our conventional modes of design. And so I think it's really important that we're able to find other ways of drawing. I wanted to say invent new forms of drawing, but I really think that these forms are all around us, and it's really about tapping into those and amplifying and sharpening aspects of our context and bringing those into our designs.
Sumayya, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I think what you've showed us today is really nothing short of mind-blowing. what you just mentioned is actually where I wanted to ask a question, but also maybe make an observation. It's really rare, I think, and so refreshing to see the presentation of the work kind of speak in the same tone, I guess, as the work itself. And something that I wanted to ask you about, I mean, you brought up this, in the archives project, I think it comes up where you say the way we put things together tells us about ourselves and our biases. And I wanted maybe to ask you a little bit about how you put the materials of your projects together for today's conversation, and how you're bringing together scales, histories, bodies, choreographies, events, liquids, dust particles, colors, and points of view. But also, bringing your thinking process, revisions, issuing to quantity surveyors, and so on, I thought was really incredibly beautiful. And I'm interested in the way that the way that you showed us the work through the sampling and the editing, the fast pace, and maybe the incompleteness, allows and even maybe encourages different readings, but also a kind of drifting to happen in our minds, not just between the projects, but between the different contexts in which and worlds in which these projects exist, right? And their inseparability in a sense. And I guess one thing that happens when, we're brought together through our computers, each from within the spaces where we're living and working, is that we bring with us a lot of things, each of us. Something that I'm bringing right now is just a few minutes before we gathered, I received an email from another scholar that I admire greatly, announcing an event that she's putting together titled Unlearning. Sumayya Vally of the Cornell School of Architecture, who's with us on the call, referencing Ariella Azoulai's recent publication, Potential Histories, Unlearning Imperialism, and also referencing, Unlearning the City book, as well as the recent Black faculty at the School of Architecture at Columbia, Unlearning Whiteness. And I wanted maybe to ask you about the format of presentation, specifically around the questions of unlearning, unlearning our tools, our modes of representation, our politics of communication, how we think about sharing. So I thought maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Thank you, Nora, for that question. It's wonderful to meet you. Thank you for those beautiful reflections also. It was very quick in putting this presentation together. I apologize for any technical glitches and audio glitches and so on. But I'm glad that you felt immersed in it, and thank you. I feel honored by that. I also saw Sumayya on the call. I think she did have to go to a meeting, and I've also been reading about her Unlearning series, and I think it looks really, really fantastic. And absolutely, I think that is something that I'm very conscious of, or maybe perhaps I think it was kind of subconscious in my work in the beginning when we started, this idea of working in different ways, of publishing in different platforms, of working with different media that might be errant or subversive or guerrilla, if you want to call it that. But it's become something that's a lot more conscious in the way that I practice and in the way that I present as well. And a big part of the work of Counterspace, actually, we just started another arm called Counterpoints, which is about collective work. And I started it with my colleague Sarah de Villiers and several other people during COVID as a, how do I say, a kind of financial, in response to a financial need, but it's also become a much bigger and deeper project about collaborating and, how do we say, learning different ways to network and to publish by ourselves. And I think that something that's very, I don't know, close to my heart, and I think comes through a little bit in this presentation as well, is also about the format that we have for dialogue. And I think often the lecture podium and the auditorium format is a certain kind of format that demands certain kind of language and a certain kind of audience. And I think that those are important, but I'm also really, really interested in how we can extend beyond that to include other disciplines and other forms of knowledge that cannot be included in those formats. So usually, if I'm not presenting virtually, I also like to present by way of performance with multiple projectors, slightly better controlled audio than today. But I think that that's a small example of an attempt at undoing a format that we know, and also an attempt at bringing in something from other ways of doing. In my context, if we look at the origins of sharing knowledge, they are often oral and oral. Conversations happen around dinner tables and so on, and knowledge is shared in those platforms. And sometimes when we organize events, it's also really important for us to think through the choreography of how people sit together, how information is shared, or if we set up, for example, a shop front that is about knowledge sharing and knowledge exchange, we also try and do something with the format. So we think through, can we combine knowledge sharing with an, I don't know, ice cream store, for example. I'm just making it up as I go along. But, you know, I also showed this project Backstory, which was an attempt really at that, physically taking architecture to the street and inviting in forms of knowledge that the discipline doesn't usually engage with. So it's absolutely on top of what I'm thinking through at the moment. And I hope that we'll have many more conversations around this as well. It's really great to see the work that Samia and yourselves and so many others are doing around this as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I guess I'll start perhaps by reading one of them, where Taisha, a student in the 5th year, currently working on her thesis at Cooper, saying that she really enjoyed a comment in the video where you said that, that stories are their own kind of soft data. And if you could elaborate on that idea.
Sure. I think it extends from the previous question and response. I'm really interested in other forms of knowledge, and without sounding like a post-truth advocate, because I promise I'm not. I know that you've just all been through an election and so on. But I think that there are forms of knowledge all around us. In South Africa, so many of my projects have been inspired by myths and legends, rumors around things that have then been scientifically proven. For example, the Mine Dump project, some of the research around that, where an unmarked graveyard of 650 bodies was found, that was previously unfound, undocumented in our history books. But there was this myth about, or this legend about these graves that were on this hill that turned out to be true. There are several other examples of stories like this that I think have found their ways into our work and into our projects. And I think that also because of what is and what can be included in history and in the archives and as we know them now, so much gets left out. And I'm really, really interested in how we can work with things that are beyond the formal archive. So working with recipes, working with songs and stories and so on, and really pushing these and treating them with, as much respect as we do work and material that's in the formal archive or that has been formally mapped and documented, I think is really important. As a contribution to making a visible archive, of course, but also as inspiration for new design form.
And we also want to open it up for anyone to, unmute themselves and join the conversation.
I'll ask a question if that's okay. Sumayya, I want to thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and it was such an empowering and challenging presentation. It's very interesting because last week we had a lecture which was about learning precedents from a very established architect. And this week we're talking about unlearning. And I guess that my question is, it's about building, and I'm not an expert on building because I don't have that much experience. I've experience in exhibitions, curatorial projects, research, and so forth. But you are about to build a very important pavilion that becomes a symbol for the act of building itself, which was assigned to very well-known architects. And I really love the fact that you're presenting your practice as an atlas, as a composite, a constellation, a kind of aggregation of all of these diverse ideas and multitudes, and that have complex affinities between one another. I think that's extraordinary. And if you think back historically, in terms of research, I can think of A.B. Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas and a number of projects in the history of art and architecture, which have used and utilized the idea of an atlas. I wonder if that can or may be applied to the to architecture, to the discipline within which we're all engaged, or if what is the limitation or the threshold to which that logic of inclusiveness and inclusivity can be applied. Are there limitations? And you're part of an emerging generation of architects that are about to reestablish what that is.
Yeah, I thank you, Lydia. I really love this idea of the atlas, or sometimes also in my work, I call it the almanac, like bringing together fragments of disparate things and weaving them together somehow in practice. I think I certainly feel with my students and my peers and colleagues that there is something happening in this generation of architects and architecture that is open to taking on different forms of practice and different kinds of media and so on. And I think I'm definitely a believer in building buildings and in built architecture, and I hope to make a lot more of it. I love architecture with a capital A, and I love all the architectures with all the small a's as well. But I think that it's important to, that for me at least, that all of these streams of different forms of architecture and all of these things that work at different speeds also happen at the same time. I think it's really important to be able to practice at the slow, meandering pace of research work that is ongoing and endless, in the form of teaching studios, in the form of ongoing documentation and writing and so on. But I think at the same time, it's really important for my generation, and especially I think for my context, that we do start to build and test ideas boldly. And I think that, you know, often as Africans, we also get asked this question, what does African expression or African identity look like in architecture? And we're always saying that it's a difficult question to answer because we're still in the process of working through and formulating it. And we have inherited a legacy that's been ravaged by colonization and so on. But I think that we, at the same time, this is the context that we've inherited. And there is also so much around us that is, yes, it's challenging, but it's also optimistic. And we have to, I don't know, hold this weight, but also hold this optimism of being able to create boldly with all of these new forms, with all of these new media and in all of these new ways. And I think that working at several speeds and in several ways simultaneously, hopefully different streams of work start to speak with each other and catalyze each other. And I certainly feel that way in my practice as well. I don't know if it came through in today's presentation, but a lot of the projects are linked And sometimes projects that come from slow research trajectories become a one-day installation that happens very quickly. So yeah, I am very optimistic about my generation. And I also think that some of the forms that we are working with now, if we think of media that is digital and of even, you know, pop culture and advertising and bringing these into practice, I think has some synergy with ways of being that are embodied and that are oral and shifting and evolving and mutating. I think that these other forms are able to hold that a little bit better than the architecture that we have and know at the moment. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but yeah.
I just want to follow up on that, Sumayya, which is the question of defining a design language in this context. And I think it seems like a lot of your projects were grappling with that, right? The hands-on math, I think those were Ndebele patterns that you were dealing with. Your mosque was dealing with those conflicting geometries. The art center was contending with this rammed earth aesthetic. And yeah, it was just, I was really curious about what does a kind of African aesthetic look like, what it can be, how are you defining that? And that was really a question that I had, but I don't think there's an answer, right? I think all of your projects are trying to tackle this from one side or another, whether it's a tectonic issue, a material issue, a legibility or a sign or a symbol. I think there's so many there, and I think you are coming at it from many different forms and media all at the same time.
I think, of course, we always say that it's difficult and problematic to think about something as broad as an African aesthetic in very narrow terms. And I think that in every single project, perhaps there is a search for something different and a search to articulate one aspect of some form of identity. And I am really interested in tackling that from as many angles as possible, as you're saying, in the formal and in pattern and symbol and so on, but also in other things that are intangible, in working with sound. And that's also why I'm interested in working through performance and choreography and things, because I think that really those ways of doing and being are things that come out of this context in the ways that we, for example, remember or gather, or it's much less about being in a space that is, or being in a space that's petrified or petrifying something to remember it. It's much more about remembering through something that is lived or living. And I also think that in that there are also clues for how we can work with program and other notions as well.
If I could also follow up on your response to Lydia's question, and in relation to bringing together disparate or seemingly disparate parts or weaving them together, I wanted to ask you maybe to elaborate a little bit on the process in which the Serpentine Pavilion is going to be coming together, as it will be happening in different parts of London. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
I don't know if I can talk about that too much, Nora. I can no, that's fine. I can talk a little bit about my intents, but I'm also scared of what I may say that's not yet finalized. But yeah, the idea really is that I really felt that the park was waiting for a gesture of some kind, and I really deeply felt like I wanted to fold London into the pavilion and fold the pavilion out into the city. And that's, I think, where that intuition came from. I really wanted to work with the idea of having, not just including several other groups and people and places through the program into the pavilion, but I really had this urge to physically work with other areas and other neighborhoods. And that's come through in the form, and hopefully in the choreography it will as well. But of course, COVID has presented us with many challenges around engagements, also working through new forms of engagement on platforms like this. And I'm also currently working on extending these ideas of the pavilion in my own geography and my own context, because I am able to engage here. We're in summer, and at the moment, we don't have as stringent a lockdown. Everyone's being really careful. So I'm also working with extending these ideas in my own context. Let's see what happens.
If I can jump in 1 second, just because it's been really wonderful to see you and also to see you grow in all these years. I want to say that together, following a little bit the comments that were made, together with this idea of the soft data, I think I found really interesting also the idea of the lighter infrastructure and just the idea of the stories, the voices, the recipes. And it all really goes into these incredible atmospheres and tones that you're generated and that I know are so within you and within the culture and within the culture of Johannesburg. And I think for me, one thing that was very exciting also to see is how much you celebrate the experience, like in the Uber project, the skateboard project, like the actions and the activities and the things that go inside spaces. And it's interesting now to talk about the Serpentine Pavilion, because in a way, I think what I'm expecting is the experience even more than the form. So I think is a really exciting place for you to be, somewhere between the idea of how you formalize a lot of this richness and complexity that you come from, but also the idea of how you generate and curate this incredible experience. So, bravo.
Thank you so much, Ada. Thank you. It's been an honor to have learned from you and Giuseppe all these years. And I'm so also honored that we've kept in such contact. I was taught by Ada and Giuseppe at one of their studios in Johannesburg, and they've been mentors to me for many years. So it's really wonderful to hear you say that, Ada. And also incredible for me to hear that you can feel Johannesburg in the work and in the presentation. I think absolutely this idea of act and of action and of atmosphere is really important. And I don't know that it's coming through in my forms and in the work that we're creating yet, but it is absolutely at the heart of the inspiration for every project, including the Serpentine as well. And I think I approached it very much in the same way that I would approach a project in Johannesburg. I saw the city as fragmented, but also as having so much cultural richness in all of these areas and all of these neighborhoods, which is something very resonant with Joburg as well. And I think most cities have that. It's just that in Joburg, we have a really extreme example. So if that can turn a mirror on another city, I'm also really grateful for that. And I do hope that it will be something of an experience to be there. Hopefully when we can all gather together.
Can I ask a question? Okay, so hi Sumayya, thank you so much for presenting your work in such generous form. Apart from the explicit references, there were stylistic references to the French New Wave, Chris Marker, and even Impressionism in the way you use color and rhythmic lyrical forms of composing images. At points, these assemblages point to me to mining, from the material mining of pigment to its sampling from images in one of the quadrants. Can you speak about your multivalent use of imagery and the way form may embody critique and or historical counterpoints?
I hope I'm going to be able to speak to the question. Thank you so much, Mauricio, for the question. I think so. I often get asked similar questions about the use of references, and also sometimes I think critiqued because I am in South Africa and I speak really passionately about African references. But I think that also we are all hybrid, and my identity, as I said, is very hybrid. And I'm really, really interested in being able to hold many, many references in the same thing and in the same form. And I know that there are tricky lines to be tread in that vein. But I do think that it is a little bit like mining. And I think that in working with all of these fragments and working with references from different places and so on, we're also able to articulate something of our connections between each other. And yeah, I think that we also, a big part of our context is inherited. And so we do have these references to work with because we've inherited them. I'm speaking in English at the moment, which is my mother tongue, and it shouldn't be, which is what, one example. I have nothing against that either. It's something that I'm here to work with. I feel like I lost your question a little bit, but do you want to chat about it a bit more?
Well, I'm wondering if any of these references become a kind of departure point for you in terms of setting up a decolonial decolonial form or a body of work in a way, by first referencing these things that we might have inherited but might not be part of, it might not speak for themselves, or that the form speaks for something that you cannot speak because it was taken from you or something. I guess what I'm saying is there is a bivocal way in which this work is speaking, right? There is what is being said, but then there is the way in which the form itself is speaking. And I was wondering if you could speak from a more explicit way, kind of your experience of making in the kind of references that are in your head that you might not put into the text, into the voiceover, but are in the thinking behind the composition or behind all these formal ways in which you're doing things.
Sure. I think, I think that it's a very big question. Whenever we talk about decoloniality, I think that questions, or that it's dense to unpack in a conversation like this. But I think that I do believe that in the work and in the ways of thinking, there are departure points from references that I've been taught and that I learned in my architectural training, which was for the most part quite traditional. And in the letter that Lydia mentioned in the beginning of this talk, I mentioned looking for architecture in places that are overlooked, and in we talked about it a little bit just now, also looking for architecture in recipes and in stories, and finding inspiration in the atmospheres of our cities, and in reading really the language of how people do things, and the rituals and the lives of people, how our cities function. We have lots of economies that are rogue and that function despite the formal city and despite so many things that we've inherited. And I think that there's a lot of intelligence to be drawn in those things. So my work is also it's also concerned with that which is mobile and pop-up, and I mentioned things like guerrilla a little bit earlier on, and I think that those can be read from other references that we know, but they really are coming from my context as well. So if we look at the way that informal trade works in our city, the way that taxi hailing works in our city. Roadside hair braiding, for example, has been hugely inspirational for me in terms of the Uber project that I showed, but also this campus wall edge project, you know, how to accommodate for different kinds of functions, sitting and waiting, things that we take for granted. I am really inspired by the fabric of the city. And I think that in looking to things also that are atmospheric or that are choreographed or performed, embodied, and working with dance and with different forms of music and so on, and trying to work with those in the architecture, there's also something of trying to bring in a different kind of language. So I think it's a very long-term question, and I think that I'm working through it. At least I'm trying to. But even though it may seem that these references come from other places, there also definitely are things that I'm reading in my own city and drawing on for inspiration.
Sumayya, let me try to ask a question that may in some way overlap with Mauricio's, Nora's, and a couple of others. But I was struck by the way in which the construction of atmosphere in your talk is paired up with specifications of materials and those things that usually go in a spec book. Mm-hmm. And your allusions are not to poetics, but rather concrete facts, lists, punch lists, things like that. Still, your forms of representation are sequestered to that which is filmic, and that which is not are the still images of architectural representations. I am part of a committee now, or several committees, that is revisiting the question of decolonization and challenging the very representations around which architecture has been revolving for several hundred years, to imagine other ways in which questions of specification can be approached. Mm-hmm. And I guess that would be my question to you. How do you balance out the architectural specifications that you invariably have to encounter, and how are you redefining the representational role that you've inherited and now have to reproject out there?
Thank you. Again, I don't know if I'm going to answer the question. I love these thoughts, and they are things I think about continuously every day in teaching and in practice as well. But they are things that we're working through at the moment. I think that the translation into the specifications and so on comes about because of the project, if I can say it like that. So everything that I showed has been in response to a brief, and what I tried to articulate by reading through things in the spec sheet is how things about the concept filter down into how I think through the spec sheet as well. So sometimes on the spec sheet, there are things that don't necessarily belong there. For example, in the Folded Skies project, the glass was tinted with recycled pigments from the mine dump that clean out the water and so on, and I don't know, heavy inorganic metal pigments, but at the same time they were, you know, that's what was specified on the spec sheet. And there are also other things on the spec sheets like neon flecks and velvet and specific colors and hues of gold and so on. And I think that in very small ways, but in very real practice terms, those are assertions of bringing something other into a discipline that in my context has been very traditionally monochromatic and very white, pale male, heteronormative, and so on. And so I think that these small assertions in the spec sheets are a response to that, and they're a conscious decision around that. But I think that in my teaching studio, which is much more engaged with the longer questions around decoloniality and around different forms of expression and different uses for architecture, you know, my students are not always so concerned with making buildings and really about employing the architectural realm and architectural tools for something else. And you know, there our spec sheets look very different. They are reams of choreography. They do become very lyrical, and I think that they are interesting combinations of working through architectural terms, but in other ways. I can't think of an example to show you, but for example, in the video, there was a floor surface that one of my students worked on called How Much Do You Weigh?, where she choreographed a performance on a floor surface that was very architecturally specified and described, but started to bring in a totally different language as well. So I think that, again, I think time scales is a key thing to think about. And I think on the scale of practice and in the everyday, there is one way to handle this idea of the architectural tool and the spec sheet. But hopefully with where we're going longer term and you know, also in pedagogy and in teaching, I think that that's going to start to filter down and become very different in terms of new architectural vocabularies and languages.
There's another question in the chat that that relates to some of the things that we've been discussing, but maybe asks a little bit more about method. And that's Juan Carlos, also a student. I don't know, JC, if you're here and would like to ask it yourself, otherwise I could read it. So he said he really appreciated your comment on engaging with forms of knowledge that may be otherwise ignored. And if you could expand on that engagement, on how the engagement itself is enacted. So how the stories are found, how do you decide which warrants further research, especially in relation to a comment about inclusiveness and guerrilla tactics?
I think that platforms for engagement also have to be designed because the platforms for engagement that we have, and I talked a little bit about it when we talked about Unlearning, the lecture theatre, for example, and other, you know, the conference and, you know, several forms that we have, even of engagement, exclude people. So I think that in terms of how engagement is enacted and how stories are found, it's also really important that we think through the form of engagement. I mentioned a project earlier called Backstory, where we occupied a shopfront in inner city Johannesburg in Braamfontein, and that became a way of engaging with students around the time of Fees Must Fall and several other political movements by young people in the city. And there we had several events that involved musicians and performers. We had film screenings and so on, and we really tried to work with social media and tried to bring in people in a different platform to traditional engagement workshops and so on. In the Vleerhof project that I showed as well, we designed an oral history booth. Well, we didn't call it that, but we had a market day, and we had a little stall that we designed where people brought their grandmothers to tell stories of, you know, what it was like to live in the area during apartheid. And we also tried not to work with translators for much of that experience. So I think that it's a really important question. And I think that we should never imagine that our forms of engagement are given, but really to think through for every project, to design the question itself and to design the platform of engagement as well is really important.
I have a tiny question.
Hi, Farzan.
Hey, Sumayya. And just maybe like a comment, maybe the comment first, just absolutely extraordinary lecture. I found myself like double clicking to make it bigger, closing my chat, like shutting down every window, and then just zooming in as much as possible because I wanted it to be bigger and I wanted all like the entire experience. And so just to produce that effect on at least this audience member in a moment where we're utterly exhausted by anything that comes out of here is, I think, just an extraordinary understanding of media. And I'm absolutely impressed by the way that you're operating in these two ways, that the media that surrounds the built object and the built object. And I think that allows you, at least as I can see, to be able to speak to a very wide audience and to be able to operate in both professional, academic, and critical spheres as a teacher and as a practitioner. I think that's really rare. And that's like incredibly kind of powerful and commendable. And, you know, I'm thinking in the kind of context of unlearning, I'm thinking about the last time, at least, you know, figures in our discipline theorized practice. You know, we have kind of Bernard Shumi's talking about architects don't pick their clients, they pick concepts, or Rem Koolhaas is talking about surfing the wave or something. And, you know, they're both somehow a way to produce some distance between the types of projects we work on and the types of ideas we're engaged in. And to see you kind of offer a different strategy here through the fragments, through the personal stakes in a project, and to kind of find a way for you to do exactly what you're doing, to theorize that kind of strange relationship architects have with the client as the sort of, you know, instigator of work, and for you to find a way to strategically manage that, I think is incredibly extraordinary. And so I now forgot my question. What was my question? I guess my question was, my question was this. So I thought that was pretty impressive, but then I thought it was pretty ridiculous that you showed like 100 projects and each of them you argued for them. And like you made a claim and a stake for each. And so I think that's also really rare, to kind of put yourself out there and to say, this is what it's about, this is how I'm working through it. So I guess my question was maybe like, you know, thinking to our students and thinking for myself, like that question of risk and how you're going, like how, you know, because obviously there's things you did 10 years ago, you're looking at again and you have new information, you're thinking about it in different ways. And I'm sure you're framing them in different ways for yourself now. And I'm sure every time you do one of these lectures, but it seems like every time you're doing something, you're putting yourself out there and you're trying to build something. And so that risk, you know, how do you sort of engender more sort of care around, you know, a profession to take risks in the way you're doing it? And, you know, are there some lessons you've learned, or is that like is that a community of practice kind of model? Yeah, I'm really curious about that, because I found the extraordinary risks you're taking to be the most impressive thing out of all the impressive things I saw today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that question, Farzan. I think that, I mean, amazing that you're talking about theorizing practice from the perspective of Shumi and Koolhaas and so on. I think that risk is something that comes with working in Joburg. And also this idea of fragments is something that comes from working in Joburg. And this idea of piecing together, we call it small linyana things, is something that comes from working in Joburg. So I think that, you know, I do the most with what I can in every project and in every project context. And yeah, I think, I don't know, I don't know how else to answer it. I think that I don't know that I'm in a position not to be taking a risk. And also that for the way that the practice has been set up and the kinds of work that we've gotten in up to now, it is just very much about taking risks and about being bold enough to stake a claim and to say this is what this project is going to be about. But yeah, I think I also believe in listening deeply to place, and this place is really fraught and full of challenges and full of inspirations. But there is also something of a hustle in the city that I very much hope that I embody as well. And I think that I'm not risk averse by any means. And if anything, architecture needs us to take much bigger risks at the moment.
maybe also folding in on this, Farzan brought it up, and so did you, but maybe less directly, around the distance between, I think this is really important also for the students in the room, the distance and the detachments that are kind of, fabricated through the tools that traditionally we are, learning, and we have been learning to use. This distance between you and your work, you and your sites, you and your claims, and the collapsing of those, I guess, it relates to what you said about not being in a position to take risks, to not take risks, sorry. So I don't know if you could comment on that, this fabrication of distance and detachment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, something that I'm thinking about so much at the moment, coming out of this phase of COVID. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, especially, it struck me. I don't know. I felt a little bit, on the one hand, disappointed, but also amazed at how attached my way of being is to being in Johannesburg and to being in the city. And I think that that's a really important part of my practice as well. And I absolutely think that the tools that we have force distance so often. And I think, of course, I think that distance is important. And I think that being able to read things with, a very zoomed out lens is also important. I also believe in, like you said, in the way that I look at dust and particles and molecules and so on, in looking at things that are moving too fast or too slow for us to see, or things that looking at things that are too small or too big for us to understand, even if we think climatically and so on. I think those things are really important. So I think distance is important, but I think that there is also something really important about closeness and about being embodied, about dialoguing with place before one projects onto place. And often I think that distance is a lot about projecting, and that is important. I think architecture is propositional at its heart, and that we should be projecting, but I think that before that step, the step of having dialogue with the place is really important. So of listening, learning, interpreting, and then projecting, I think. So I think that, I hope I'm answering. I think that distance is important, but I think that our tools of distance need to be supplemented with other tools that are about closeness, about immersion, about experience, about engagement. And at the moment, many of the tools that we have are unable to hold those things and to hold these other ways of being and doing and of space making. So I think it's maybe not about negating the current tools, but about supplementing them.
And maybe Sumayya, good. Oh, Max, I was going to read your question, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I wanted to actually, to that point of tools on space making, because something I interpreted in your response to Nader's question when you started to speak on what you do with in your studios with the students, and how they're incorporating performances, or how you use projections, or even in the beautiful way you presented your work today through the various medias. I'm curious if you're positioning architects to focus on kind of the temporal aspects of space as the spatial design elements or medias, and if I was interpreting that correctly or not. And if so, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that including temporal tectonics, as you call it, is definitely maybe not the only thing, but I think it's definitely something that we should be considering more and more. And I think that that's something as well that comes from my context. So often, as I said, our ways of being, our ways of remembering, our ways of honoring are oral and performed. And again, things that are static are not able to hold that. And when I was responding to Maurizio, I also mentioned things in the city that are mobile or that carry a certain atmosphere that we can draw on as practitioners, as you know, we can learn from those things. I think that including all of these things, the temporal, the atmospheric, the choreographed, the performed, looking in other places and looking at other ways of being and including those in our work is really important. And I think that schedules, performances, events, media, certainly some of them, but there are others too. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sumayya. I don't know if there are any last closing questions. Otherwise, I know everyone's starting class in 15 minutes and maybe appreciate a little bit of a Zoom break. So I don't know if there's any closing comments. Otherwise, anybody?
Maybe a small question around the role of poetry in your work.
I don't know if I have a direct answer. I certainly read poetry and I also have worked a lot with choreographers and choreographers. I've worked with performers. I've worked with poets as well, and I think that it's important that architecture has a reassertion of different forms of poetry, and I feel like I'm repeating myself. But also that, you know, even in the most toxic of situations, in the most challenging of places, it's really important that architecture is a force of poetry. And I will just end that comment by saying that in my practice context, I think that we could do with a lot more poetry and imagination. I feel like we have two separate camps of practice for the most part. One of them is really concerned with service delivery, so with provision of housing and schools and so on, which is super important. But often I think that kind of practice feels like it is a bit of a luxury to think about aesthetics and poetry. And on the other hand, we have practice that is north looking or west looking, whichever way one is orientated, and very much focused on being a world-class African city and making kind of starchitect blobs. And I think that both of these camps of practice, if I can call them that, could really do with more poetry and with more imagination, and also with thinking through practice in a less binary form. I think that the project of including poetry in our work is deeply political. And it's an assertion of us, you know, self-identifying and of asserting design expression. And I think that for me, that is the most important and the most political work there is to do, is to find ways to insert poetry into our landscapes.
Thank you. And Farzan is right, it wasn't a small question, but I am happy to end on this note.
Thank you, Sumayya. It seems like your work definitely resonated with a lot of the thesis students here. And on that note, we would love you to be invited further into the conversation, maybe in the context of a review or a workshop with us. So stay tuned for that invitation too. But thank you for taking the time today. Lydia.
Thank you, Sumayya.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so excited to have met all of you. And it's really, as I said, it's a deep honor for me to be in your presence. I think so highly of your work and of all of you, really. So it's amazing. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.